You're listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. I'm here with my friend Vaneetha Risner. Hi Vaneetha, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I am doing well, thank you. For those not yet familiar with Vaneetha and her work, Vaneetha writes and speaks about finding hope in suffering. Her Bible study, Desperate for Hope, questions we ask God in suffering, loss and longing, as well as her memoir, Walking Through Fire, encourage readers to turn to Christ in their pain. Her own story includes childhood bullying, losing an infant son, developing post-polio syndrome and going through an unwanted divorce. If you want to read more of Vaneetha's work, she has a website, vaneetha.com. She's a regular contributor for Desiring God, has been featured on Family Life Today, Life Today TV and Joni and Friends. And Vaneetha, I think you hold a bachelor's degree in business from University of Virginia and an MBA from Stanford University. So I'm sort of curious, before we get into the meat of our conversation about suffering, well, maybe that was a period of suffering going through Stanford Business School, I don't know. I'd love to hear more about your kind of professional life when you were fresh out of Stanford Business School. What did you end up doing?
Yeah, well, between undergrad and grad school, I went into banking. So I was in commercial lending, mergers and acquisitions. And I realized I was not a numbers person, Rebecca, when I made a huge mistake and was trying to lend somebody $100 billion instead of $100 million. Ooh. And I realized maybe I needed to get out of banking, but I didn't know anything besides business. So I went back and got my MBA to be in marketing. So I worked as a product manager for a number of years. And then I worked in management consulting for a few years before I had kids. And then my kids were quite a handful. So I was like, I don't think I can do this and raise them. So.
Gosh, I've had a number of friends who've been management consultants and have basically traveled Monday to Thursday. Like that's just been their rhythm. You know, I'll be somewhere in the world during that period. At one point, actually, when my best friend from college, she worked for McKinsey for a number of years, and they had a deal at the time where basically, if you were stationed in whatever part of the world, at the weekend, they would either fly you back home or fly somebody of your choice out to stay with you for the weekend. So, I got to go and visit her in sort of random places. Sort of.
Wow! I didn't have quite that kind of a job, so they wanted me to travel, and I didn't get anybody to visit. So it just got to be a lot, and so decided to stay home with the girls, and then life just happened, and did not go back to business. Yeah,
I feel like from friends who've been through the consultancy experience that many sort of long for some kind of escape. But tell us more, Vaneetha. So you've lived a kind of very interesting life so far. Perhaps not one that you would have, as a small child, kind of set out to write the story of your life so far. If you were imagining your perfect future. So tell us a little about your life up to this point and how you became a Christian. I'm always kind of curious to hear people on this podcast kind of tell us about their own story of faith. So maybe let's start there of how you became a Christian and how that's been relevant to you so far in life.
Oh, great. Well, I was born in India and my parents were Christians. When I was 3 months old, I contracted polio, but polio had been virtually eradicated. The vaccine had been developed, a decade before. So the doctors had no idea what I had. And so they gave me cortisone to lower my fever, which was about 105. So I was 3 months old, so they knew they needed to do something. But cortisone is the worst thing to give polio because it breaks down your body's immune system. And so within a couple of days, I was a quadriplegic. Wow. And then the doctor said, we made a mistake. She had polio, but you should leave India because we have no medical care that's really going to be helpful. So we left India and moved to England, actually, lived there for a year.
Oh, and really? Then, which part of England?
We lived in London, actually. But I was one, so I don't remember it. But my dad, it was interesting because my dad was a professor in a university in India, but they told him he had to get out quickly. So he took a job installing telephones in London just to get good medical care. But then somebody realized he wasn't a normal installer, and they were moving to Canada, and they offered my dad a job in Canada. Oh, so we moved from England to Canada, and I started having surgeries. So I lived, I would say, before I was 8, probably half my life in the hospital, like literally half my life. I lived on a ward with about 14 other kids and could only see my parents on weekends.
Oh, wow.
When I was home, I thought the hospital was really hard, but when I was home, I was bullied a lot in school. I mean, kids would make fun of the way that I walked. They'd ask me what was wrong with me. You know, when I was 7, these kids threw stones at me, these boys, and knocked me down and called me a cripple. Wow. And I remember right then, Rebecca, saying, God is not good. Like, I went to church with my parents, and they would always say, you know, God has got a plan for your life. Well, I thought that was ridiculous. I thought for people who are quote unquote normal, maybe God has a good plan for their life. But I didn't think God had a good plan for my life. And so I went through, I would say, grade school, middle school, pretty angry with God. And then, and with everyone. I mean, my parents would attest. I was a pretty angry person. But when I got to high school, I got involved in FCA, which is Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And it wasn't because I was an athlete or a Christian. I tell people I wanted to fellowship with the athletes. So I went because all the cute guys in my high school went to FCA. And I wanted to get to know them. So a friend of mine and I would sit in the back, and we wanted to talk about boys. We didn't take the God stuff seriously at all. But one day she went away on a retreat and came back and said, God is real. And I remember that day just being so upset because I thought she's going to be one of those people that wants to talk about God. And she did. She would talk about God all the time, just kind of slipping it into conversations. And it so annoyed me. But then finally one day I just went home and I said, God, if you're real, show me. Nothing happened. And then I decided maybe I should open the Bible. Now, I had been confirmed in our church and I had gotten a Bible, which I had never read. But I picked up the Bible and I'm going to tell you what I did, which I would not recommend doing, but I kind of randomly started flipping through it. And I remember I started with Leviticus, you know, and I was reading about, you know, boils and infected hairs and skin disease. And I was thinking, this is what I think about the Bible. But then I asked God, if you're real, why did you let this happen? And I flipped to John 9. And it's the passage where Jesus and his disciples walk by and they see a man blind from birth. And the disciples ask Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus says, it is not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the work of God would be displayed in his life. Well, that was the moment for me. I had been asking God, why? Like, what had I done wrong? Like, why? What was the cause? But God was answering a why question, but not one I had asked, which is why, what was the purpose? The purpose was that my life would bring glory to God. And just this answering, this sense that God had a purpose for my life amazed me. So this God that I thought didn't exist, or if he did, he didn't care, knew me and cared about me. So I committed my life to a God I didn't know, but I realized knew me.
Wow. Was that just on that day, or was that kind of a process?
It was on that day, because when I read that, it was almost like this spotlight was shining on the Bible, and God was like, I'm talking to you. And it was really a wild experience. I mean, I still remember it, and there was no doubt after that. Like, this was an answer to a question I had asked in a way that I wouldn't have even thought to answer it. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking when I flipped open the Bible, Rebecca. I was very arrogant, like, God, show me something. So I wouldn't recommend that either, my attitude, but it's incredible how God uses even those things in our lives. So yeah, committed my life to Christ, but I was sure my life would be perfect after that. And
interesting.
Was excited.
Yeah. So talk us through from that point then. You decide to become a Christian. You're like, this is, clearly going to fix everything in my life. Everything's going to be good now. Tell us the story from there.
Yeah, I was sure I was about to live my best life now. And for a while, I was living my best life. Like, I went away to college, had that job where I did make a few mistakes in banking, but, I went to Stanford, met and married a classmate, and things were great. But then they weren't. I had 4 miscarriages. Then I had a daughter named Katie, and then I was 20 weeks pregnant with our son when I found out he had a heart problem. He had surgery at birth, was doing great, but he was doing so well, the doctor impulsively took him off all of his medicine, saying he didn't need it anymore. And 2 days later, he died. And, at his funeral, I remember saying, God never makes a mistake. But after that, I wanted to pull all of those words back because it felt like God had really made a mistake and life wasn't the way I expected it to be. And I really pulled away from God at that point. I had been teaching a Bible study and just sort of felt that God somehow owed me. Like, you live a good life, you commit your life to Christ, it should work out. And so I didn't really know what to do or what to say and felt very disconnected from God. And then one day I was driving in the car, just so discouraged. And I just said, God, I need you to draw near to me. I need you to help me. And Rebecca, the presence of God filled my car at that moment in a way that has never happened to me before or since. And it was just this moment where God was like, I am with you. I didn't understand why Paul died, but I knew at that moment that God was going to be with me through everything. And it was probably the purest, most joyful moment I've ever had. And so after that, my view of God in the midst of suffering had really changed. And I learned about lament, which is sort of a complicated Christian word, but lament is really just grieving, crying out to God, telling him everything you feel while trusting in his goodness. And I learned after I had really encountered him in my car, God is good. God can be trusted. But I learned I could tell him exactly how I feel. I didn't need to come all dressed up and say all the right things. And I think prayer before for me had sounded like the King James Bible, like, thou art holy, God. I just didn't think I understood what conversation with God meant. And after Paul died, I understood that because I had permission, or felt that I had permission that I didn't believe I had before, although I always had permission to tell God exactly how I feel. And the Psalms in the Bible, those are, they call them the prayer book of the church, and they show us how to pray. And a lot of them are really angry tears and crying out to God honestly. And yet it is when we do that, I think we really find God in a different way. So that was a huge turning point in my life. And then 6 years, so I had a daughter, Christy, after Paul died. And then several years after that, I was diagnosed with post-polio syndrome, which, I had polio and learned to walk, had all those operations, just was really doing fine. But when I was diagnosed with post-polio syndrome, they told me that my body was going backwards. And one day I would be the way I was when I first got polio, which I was a quadriplegic.
Yeah.
And so they said the more that I did, the weaker I would get. So my strength and energy were and still are like money in a bank. And so everything I do takes away from that energy. And so one day I will be a quadriplegic. And I remember saying to them, what happens if I don't do this? Like, they said, stop doing everything. Stop painting. I was an artist. Stop painting, stop cooking, stop doing everything, and just concentrate on self-care. And when I asked them, well, what happens if I don't do that? They said, in 10 years, somebody will be feeding you. And I'm a foodie, Rebecca. So that was like, no, I can't do that. If somebody's going to be feeding me, I need to figure this out. So I really stopped doing a lot of what I was doing. And that was a huge grief for me because I processed life through art, through painting and drawing. And so I really had to find other ways to talk to God. And then 6 years after that, though, I was figuring that out. My husband left and told me he was leaving for someone else. And he moved out of state. And I had 2 daughters, 10 and 13, to raise as a single parent.
Wow.
And they were really angry. I was angry. Life sort of exploded. It was really hard. And, I continued to ask this question that I asked at various times in my life, like, where are you, God? And why did you let this happen? But I knew God now. I knew him intimately. And yet, I find throughout my life when really hard things happen, I still ask that. And God meets me in those questions. I remember saying to my pastor when I first found out about Dave's affair, I screamed in his house, "Why does God hate me?" And it was kind of really quiet then. But that's how I felt. And at night, I would scream out into the dark, like, "God, why do you hate me?" But more than any other time in my life, I discovered how much God really loved me. And he just drew so close. Like, I would open up the Bible, and as I mentioned before, Psalms are really the prayer book of the church. And Psalm 119 is the longest book, Psalm in the chapter and Psalm in the Bible. And I used to think it was very boring. It's 176 verses about basically the word of God. And I thought it was repeated the same thing over and over again. But after Dave left, I remember opening that and finding so much comfort. And every day I would say, "My soul clings to the dust. Revive me according to your word." And that's Psalm 119:25. And God revived me. I had not taken God at his word like that before. Like, okay, I need you to help me, to meet me today. And that's when I found God can be real every single day, the way he was in the car, not exactly that, spectacular way, but in a very deep and meaningful way. Every time I opened the Bible, I felt like God met me. So that's a very long way to describe my story of suffering. There's a lot of hard things. And yet in the midst of it all, Rebecca, God was not just good. He was better than I imagined.
Yeah, I've certainly found in my own life that in periods of need is when my prayer life is actually like really come alive in a different way. When you're like, okay, Lord, I just sort of viscerally need you right now, is a very different approach than I'm like sitting down to pray this morning because that's what I need to do. And what, like when it's more this sort of desperation to it. I think maybe for me, the passage that I always come back to is in John 11 when Jesus is standing in front of Martha, who's grieving her brother Lazarus's death. And Jesus deliberately didn't come. Like when Martha and Mary called out to Jesus, like sent him a message saying, "Lord, the one you love is sick." It's sort of bizarre almost, but John's gospel says that Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and so he doesn't come. And you're like, well, that seems to make no sense. Like, why either he loves them and he came, or he doesn't love them and he didn't come. But no, it says very clearly that he loved them and he didn't come. And then he shows up when it's too late. Lazarus is already dead, and meets with Martha and says to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, will live. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" And I sometimes sort of imagine myself kind of standing where Martha stands in that story and hearing Jesus saying, "I am everything." Like, do you believe that? You think that what you most need is me to raise Lazarus. Actually, what you most need is me. You think I'm a means to an end. Actually, I'm the end. And just kind of viscerally like finding myself in those moments of needing the Lord and needing to be almost confronted with that choice in my own mind. Like, do I believe that? And actually, if I don't, my life is completely pointless anyway. Do you know?
Yeah.
It's not that we choose between a life in relationship with Jesus and a life where our lives, have no suffering and are full of purpose and meaning and joy and, eternal perspective. It's actually we choose between faith in this extraordinary, wild, outrageous claim that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and a world in which you and I are nothing but atoms and molecules. Like ultimately, mammals at best, but who cares? And we have delusions of our own existence, even, or of our own kind of real kind of mental lives. So it's sort of, it's always interesting to hear different people's kind of go-to places in the Bible, whether the places where we most kind of cling most often. Sort of
I love that passage that you love as well. And I love the other thing that Jesus says to Martha is, if you believe, you will see the glory of God. And that's right before he raises Lazarus. And I love that, or maybe it's right after, actually. I love that because when we believe, we see God. We see, we experience his presence. And I feel like the glory of God is knowing God is there. And I think that's a big part too of what he did when he raised Lazarus is, I'm the resurrection and the life. You need me and you will experience me, see me. I think through suffering.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating because the next kind of movement of that story, he meets with Martha and then with Mary, who says the same thing Martha said of, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And then he goes to the tomb with them and he weeps with them. And it's stunning because, why is Jesus crying? Like, he could have stopped Lazarus from dying. I mean, even some of the bystanders say, some people say, well, look how much he loved Lazarus. And other people say, well, wait a minute, couldn't he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have stopped this man from dying? And the answer is absolutely yes. And yet Jesus weeps with Mary and Martha. And to me, that's a indication of the fact that actually Jesus is with us in our suffering, that he holds us and weeps with us as we suffer, even though he knows that he is going to raise Lazarus from the dead, even though he knows there is going to be actually a next chapter to our story, that ultimately he's going to wipe every tear from our eyes, as we're promised in the last book of the Bible, whether in this life or the next. Even so, he weeps with us.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of intimacy with Jesus in the midst of suffering that we actually may not experience when everything's great in life,
right.
When we're sort of coasting along.
I'm guessing for Mary and Martha, that suffering would have been so hard because they would have known Jesus healed everybody, healed strangers. And this was a family that was really close to Jesus. And so I picture them sometimes like going to the window saying to each other, Jesus is going to come. Like, don't worry, right. Lazarus, Jesus is our best friend. He will show up. And I think that's sometimes how we are. We're like, of course God's going to, I thought, of course God's going to save my son. Of course God's going to do this. And when he doesn't, I love the fact that Jesus weeps with them. He knows how painful that was, that he didn't do what they expected him to do, what they'd seen him do for other people, because he had something bigger he was doing for them. But at that moment, he got how painful that was.
Yeah. I'm curious, Vaneetha, for me, it's the times in my life when I am lamenting that actually I find myself longing for the new creation, longing for when Jesus returns, longing for actually when I die and when I go to be with him. And that often in other times in my life, I'm not longing for that. I'm just not actively thinking about it. It's sort of a theoretical thing in my mind of like, yes, one day when I die, I go to be with the Lord, and when he returns and kind of establishes his new creation, I'll have eternal life with him forever, and that's great. But it's sort of not actually, I'm saying it in an almost sort of offhand way, because so often day to day, that's how I'm relating to that truth. But in times of suffering and disappointment and kind of lament and longing, that's when I am pressed to desire the new creation. And I'm curious whether that's been your experience in the various kinds of suffering you've been through as a Christian, whether it has sort of propelled you set your eyes more on the future when Jesus will wipe away every tear from our eyes. I'm curious if that's been your experience.
I think especially when I'm suffering, I think this is going to end, and it's going to end in glory. And so remembering this is not the end, because, some of our suffering does get better and we move on and things are great after that. But I feel like the time of our suffering is the time when we really press in to say it will be new one day, and we won't be crying and we won't be in pain. And I had a good friend who died of ALS last year, and that was one of the things that we would just talk about a lot. And I realized I don't talk about it enough, but talking about it with someone who has ALS, who, her life was hard up until the very end, and yet heaven awaited with incredible glory. And, she started really longing for that. That's really what our conversation was centered on. But I think as Christians, when we're not suffering, we kind of casually throw it around, but this life is satisfying. And I think it's a gift to us, really, when God strips away a lot of the things in our life, because then we realize that we are made for something more, and there is something so much better and so much more fulfilling than this life. So absolutely, I feel like suffering has made me see that, and that it's preparing us for a weight of glory that is beyond all comparison, and really recognizing that. That's a quote from the Apostle Paul, who wrote a lot of the letters in the New Testament, and he went through so much suffering, but he said, this light momentary affliction is not worth comparing with the weight of glory. Okay, that was, I butchered that verse, but anyway.
Yeah, the glory will be revealed. Yeah.
And so I really think that we have no idea all that God is going to do in our suffering. And right now, I believe there's a reward for our suffering. The Bible talks about reward, and the verse for 2 Corinthians 4:17 in the Bible, which is a letter Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he does talk about the fact that it is preparing us. And that Greek word for preparing is actually producing. So our affliction is producing something. And so it's not that, we die and it's like, wow, we got closer to God. I really believe there's a reward for that suffering. So that even more makes heaven somewhere that you can't wait to go and say, wow, I can't wait for everyone. God is going to lavish his kindness on us. So I think heaven is going to be so much better than anything we can possibly imagine on earth, which puts suffering in perspective.
Yeah, I was driving a few months ago with a young friend. It was kind of late at night and it was raining. We were driving back from a event that I've been speaking at. She'd kindly come along with me, and she's exploring Christianity, or sort of curious about Christianity, but not a follower of Jesus. And I sort of made a comment about, I'm not the world's best driver, and it was quite late and it was quite dark and it was raining. And I was like, I need to be really careful because, it'd be best if we didn't die tonight. And then I said, and actually I'd be completely fine with dying tonight. I'd be rather sad for my kids and my husband and then my friend. It would have difficult implications for others, but, for me, it would be absolutely leveling up kind of thing. And she was quite surprised by the fact that I thought that dying would actually be a really great thing for me. And we sort of spent a few minutes processing this, and I was like, well, I've told you a number of times, we've talked a lot about how the gospel, the message of Jesus, means that not only that we live in relationship with him now and we can cling to him in the midst of suffering, and that we can trust him in the highs and the lows of this life, but actually so much more than that one day we will experience him in a far richer way, and all the pain and suffering and disappointment and lowness of this world will be gone, and he will, in sort of biblical terms, recreate. There'll be a new creation. We'll have resurrection bodies that are so much better than our current bodies, which even for those of us who have long and healthy lives, at some point our bodies are going to start to let us down, and we're all going to kind of experience that one way and another, some earlier and more acutely than others, but one day we'll have resurrection bodies. And just so many ways in which actually if Jesus is who he claims to be, then meeting him face to face and living with him forever is going to be so much better than anything we can experience now. And I think sometimes it's so easy for that to get lost in our minds. I think especially when we're not facing trials, and when we are, and recognizing, oh no, this is my lifeline right now. Like this, the hope of the resurrection is what I'm clinging on to. That things, just become more clear in our minds, I think. Yeah. Maybe.
Now, how did your friend respond to that?
We have many conversations about Jesus in many kind of different formats. So I think she was sort of mildly surprised, but then it kind of made sense. And I said to her, I don't want to crash the car because you're not ready. You haven't trusted in Jesus yet. And so for that reason, even more so than for my children, we need to be careful here. But yeah, I think it is a different It's just such a fundamentally different view of the world if we know that whatever happens here and now, that actually there is going to be a happy ending to your story and to mine.
Yeah. Yeah. I love Randy Alcorn says happily ever after is a blood-bought promise for those of us in Christ. And remembering that it changes everything, because this life, no matter how long or how short, it is going to be over so quickly. In the scheme of eternity, it's nothing. And so people who bank everything on this small little thing that we call our life, compared to an eternity without God, is horrifying.
Yeah. Well, that's a great note to end on, Vaneetha. Thanks so much for talking with me today. You have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, X, whatever it's called, and Instagram. I hate the little things that we say at the end of I feel like my poor long-suffering listeners hear me sort of fudge through this part every time, Vaneetha, but you're hearing it this time. Yeah, if you want to leave a review on iTunes, then that would be fantastic, and maybe include a question you'd like to see us discuss in a future episode. My friend Kyle Worley, who I used to do this podcast with, he would always end grace and peace, and I feel like I can't do that because it would be stealing it from him. Do you have a good last thing that you say on podcasts, Vaneetha?
I don't have a good thing, but how about let me see. I sign my notes with hope, but
with hope. That's it. Okay, this is how we're clinching it this time. With hope. Thank you. Bye-bye.